Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and it's time to talk about some nerfs. That's right, nerfs are finally coming to 4 cards that I think desperately needed nerfs. So hey, Blizzard did something awesome. So you might be wondering which cards are getting nerfed if you haven't heard yet. It is Patches, Bonemare, Raza, and of course, Corridor Creeper. Now those might be the 4 primary targets for nerfs as far as I'm concerned. There maybe could have been a couple of other cards tossed in, but this is certainly going to be a huge shakeup in the meta, so who knows what's going to need nerfs after all this goes down, because everything is going to look completely different. Now, these nerfs are said to be hitting sometime next month. It's currently the very end of January, so sometime in February, who knows how soon. All of these cards will be getting the changes we're going to discuss. You'll be getting full Arcane Dust refunds if you disenchant any of these cards. But all that said, I know you guys just want to talk about the nerfs, so let's go ahead and jump into these. I'll give you my detailed thoughts on each of these cards and just how playable they might remain after these nerfs. Let's jump into it. So let's go ahead and start off with a nerf that I've called for the most often and most recently, and the one I think was the most desperately needed, and that of course is Corridor Creeper. This guy has completely dominated Hearthstone since his release in Kobolds and Catacombs. He's just too good as a 5/5 to play for free. I recently put out a video where I proposed 5 different ways that you could fix Corridor Creeper. You could essentially nerf the card without totally killing it. Blizzard certainly didn't pay attention to that video. No one would expect them to, because I think, unfortunately, they have pretty much killed Corridor Creeper with this nerf. Now, of course, I'm glad he's getting nerfed. I think he deserved it, but this might have taken things a little bit too far, as they often do. They brought the hammer down a little bit too hard. They swung the pendulum too far in the other direction. Corridor Creeper is going to be really, really hard to play with these changes, which reduces its attack from 5 down to 2. That's a huge change. Usually when Blizzard tweaks a card, it's just like 1 mana cost or 1 stat point here or there, or a small tweak to the mechanic. In this case, I left everything the same except that attack, but that might be one of the most important facets of Corridor Creeper's existence, because of course, more aggressive decks would tend to run Corridor Creeper for the pressure that it could apply on the board. It's just a big pile of stats. And being able to do 5 attack allowed it to make efficient trades sometimes, just a pile on a ton of face damage, all things which aggressive decks like to do. And at 2 attack, it's just not going to have that same influence. So there is, I think, a small chance Corridor Creeper can still see some play, right? Just playing a 0 mana 2/5 is fine. It's solid. There are decks, particularly those which synergize with beasts in particular, which might be able to utilize Corridor Creeper okay at 2 attack. Things like Hunter, you know, playing a 2/5 beast that synergizes really well with things like Tundra Rhino or Houndmaster is still a solid play. I think there's a chance it carves out a home occasionally. Now, of course, right away, everybody's going to drop this card, forget about it, call it terrible. But as time passes, I think it might sneak back in to a deck here or there. But for the most part, I think they really, really did Corridor Creeper pretty poorly here and just demolished it. I made a similar change in my requested changes for Corridor Creeper, where I tweaked only the stats, but I took it from a 5/5 down to a 5/3. So in other words, I reduced its health so that it retained the same sort of aggressive nature, that it could still be played in the same vein and in the same spirit in the same kinds of decks, but that it was just a lot easier for opponents to deal with or trade into, and it wasn't as good as taking its own value trades. So it kind of it kept it good at what it was supposed to do, but made it easier to respond to. I think, unfortunately, Blizzard made it just as hard to respond to, but kind of killed the whole purpose of the card. So a strange buff, or a strange nerf for me, as far as I'm concerned here with Corridor Creeper. It's going to fix the problem that we see Corridor Creeper too much, but I think they killed a card that some people like, some people enjoy, and they took it a step too far. So very rarely moving forward are you ever going to see Corridor Creeper in Hearthstone, I think. So now let's move on to the next nerf, and this one is, again, a desperately needed nerf. I just can't fathom what took quite so long to nerf Patches. He's been around for more than a year now, and he's been the most played card, the most hated card in Hearthstone, and I've got data to prove it, for a year now, and he's just now getting nerfed. Pirates have been everywhere for like 13 months, and finally Patches gets nerfed. Now, I think the logic Blizzard cited here was that they wanted to reduce Patches' impact forever in wild format because, of course, this card will be rotating out of standard format pretty soon. I guess they didn't want Patches to remain a problem and a dominant style of play in wild format for the rest of eternity, so they decided to nerf him. I'm okay with that logic. That's a good reason to do it. I think they could have done the same thing in standard format a little sooner, so we didn't have to wait quite so long. All that said, still a good change. And a pretty simple change here. They're just taking charge away from Patches the Pirate. And hey, that works. Like, you still get a lot of the same effect. You get to thin out your deck by pulling out a weak drop. You get some additional stats on the board immediately. It still synergizes with pirate stuff just fine. It just doesn't make that immediate direct impact, particularly in combination with things like Prince Keloseth buffs or South Sea Captain. It's not making those instant value trades. You're giving your opponent a turn, essentially, to recognize the Patches pull and address it, which is going to make Patches feel a lot more balanced. I think it'll still be a good card in pirate decks. I don't think this totally kills Patches. It would have been a nerf to Corridor Creeper in a lot of ways, ironically, although Corridor Creeper also got nerfed, as we just discussed. But this is a good way to handle Patches moving forward. It's still a lot of value. It's still a totally free kind of card. I will say, of course, that it makes Patches insanely worse when you draw him into your hand as opposed to summoning him for free, so that's going to hurt some decks quite a bit as well, because he's no longer a Stone Tusk Boar. He's now just a Snow Flipper Penguin or whatever it might be. So all in all, I think a good change, a long overdue change, but one I'm still quite happy to see. And I think Blizzard nerfed this in one of the only reasonable ways. There weren't a lot of good ways to nerf this card because you can't really reduce its health or attack, clearly, because that would make it garbage. You could maybe make it cost 2 mana, but that feels weird. So I think they did pretty much the only reasonable thing here. All in all, I think this is a good nerf. So now let's move on to the third card here that'll be nerfed, and it's Raza the Chained. And this time around, they took his hero power cost reduction, which was 0 in the past, and they increased it to 1. So instead of reducing your hero power by 2 mana, now you only get to reduce it by 1, which of course is clearly a recognition, a nod to Raza, Shadow Reaper, Anduin combinations, Highlander Priest, which is everywhere in Hearthstone, and has pretty much been a tier 1 deck since Shadow Reaper Anduin was released in Knights of the Frozen Throne, and Raza was clearly what empowered that to be so silly, a 0 mana hero power that continually does 2 damage over and over again, or 4 damage with Prophet Velen, is just absurd, way too much value in your hero power. It makes your damage combinations completely ridiculous. It basically turns every card into dealing 2 damage on top of what it originally did, and that's absurd. The burst damage you could put out with Velen and Mind Blast and Holy Smite was just far too strong, way too much for Hearthstone. And this tweak to Raza essentially kills that combination because, of course, you can't fit all of those things into the same turn as Prophet Velen. If your hero power is costing 1 mana, you just can't weave it in like you could previously, so that's awesome. Plus, it just chips away at the potential for that hero power to gain steam over the course of a game because you don't always have that 1 spare mana. You might only get 3 hero powers out in the course of a turn instead of 4 or 5. You might only be able to get 1 or 2 out instead of 3 or 4, and that's going to make a huge difference on the total output potential in a given turn for Shadow Reaper Anduin, which will inevitably hurt Highlander-style decks. Now, the question is, will this completely kill Highlander Priest decks? I think it might in Standard, just because they're already not exactly Tier 1. People are going to argue that point and say, oh my god, Highlander's the best deck in the game. It can be at the tournament level, but on the ladder, it's actually pretty much a Tier 2 deck right now. All of the data suggests that. So I don't know that it's going to make the cut in Standard format, essentially, because Highlander Priest is already kind of just barely scooting by into the higher tier plays. It might drop down to a Tier 3 deck, for instance, and only really specialists will be able to play it, or if the meta shifts around Corridor Creeper, perhaps it can maybe still make the cut, but I'm doubtful. That said, I think in Wild format in particular, you'll still see some play from Raza and Highlander-style Priest because Reno is in Wild, and Reno is good enough on his own that he sort of substantiates the reason to play that deck. So tossing in Shadow Reaper Anduin and Raza sort of feels like a freebie as opposed to building your entire deck around it. And when it's free, hey, a 1 mana hero power that does 2 damage is still really, really good, that can cycle forever. That's absurdly strong. Not as strong as we know it today, but still good enough to be a reason to include Raza and Anduin in your deck, in Wild format at the very least, along with Reno. Now, in Standard, when you have to compromise your deck a little more, there aren't as many cards available in Reno style lists in general because there's a more limited card pool, it's going to be harder for Raza to make sense. And that said, of course, we only have a couple months of Raza in standard format anyway. So I have a feeling that people are going to react to this nerf really negatively, and we won't see any Highlander Priest for the rest of standard format. Like, people will just say, nah, it's not worth it. I'm not going to bother figuring it out. It's probably still going to be decent, so if somebody does take the time and proves that it's okay, like I said, I think it could be a tier 3 deck, maybe even a low tier 2 deck, and still see some play on ladder and still make sense. Just because people have gotten so used to the archetype, they might fight for it, and it might make the cut. But most likely, I think people will overreact to the change, completely kill Highlander Priest, and this will be relegated to wild format. That's the only place it's going to see play. That said, Raza himself, still an okay card in a vacuum, still a great card, arguably with Shadow Reaper Anduin, just maybe not good enough in the highly competitive world of the Hearthstone ladder as we know it today. And as far as was this the right kind of change, yeah, I think this was good. I think this was the only way to really hurt Raza where it was strongest. Just changing the mana cost or the stats wouldn't have really affected the combo potential and the raw, just snowbally nature of this card. So you had to hit it where it mattered, which was in this hero cost or hero power cost reduction. So I think Blizzard did a good job nerfing Raza here. Again, obviously, maybe overdue. Highlander Priest has been crazy good for a very long time and very frustrating to play against because of its burst potential. So maybe this is a few months late, like every other nerf, but nonetheless, a good one. I'm happy to see it. So finally here, let's move on to the fourth and final nerf. This is Bonemare, and very simply here, Blizzard upped the mana cost of Bonemare from 7 mana to 8 mana. And I think this is an absolutely reasonable, perfect nerf. Blizzard got this one right. Frankly, I'm not even sure Bonemare needs a nerf right now anymore. It certainly felt like it in Knights of the Frozen Throne. In the Corridor Creeper world, Bonemare felt less obvious of a play, didn't seem to show up in every deck like it did in the previous meta. So I had kind of given Bonemare a pass at this point. It felt like, okay, yeah, he's still really good when you play it, and it feels really strong for a neutral common card, but that's okay from time to time. It's good to have good budget cards. So I wasn't targeting Bonemare quite as much as I had been in the past. Clearly, Blizzard still had some data or some suggestion that this card was still a little bit too good, or maybe just too cheap. Conspiracy theorists might argue. So they decided to go ahead and bump it up to 8 mana. That was a change I had proposed previously when I suggested some nerfs for this card. A pretty obvious, easy one, not claiming like, oh, I'm smart, I figured it out. It's a really simple change because the reason Bonemare was so good is because you could just barely fit it onto the end of a curve of a mid-range deck. In a lot of sort of aggressively minded mid-range decks like Tempo Rogue, for instance, Bonemare just barely made the cut because you really only wanted to go to about 6 or 7 mana in those decks. 7 mana felt a little expensive, but Bonemare was so good that you could still toss it onto the end. At 8 mana, that becomes a lot harder. It makes some of those gaps bigger from like a really strong turn 5 set of plays all the way up to turn 8 is a much bigger gap, and it's much harder to fill in, and it just makes this card harder to slot in and harder to find times to play. Also, you can't combine it with a lot of strong 3-drops that traditionally were run with it. Rogue has some good 3-drops, the Tar Creepers, the Southsea Deckhands of the world, etc. So it's a little more awkward in that regard too. So it just makes the card feel a tad more reasonable, tad more balanced. It's going to help in Arena too, so Bonemare is a little slower in Arena, so the impact it makes doesn't happen quite as quickly and doesn't have the potential to swing a game quite as hard because you give everybody a little bit more mana to respond, a little bit more mana to do their own thing first. So all in all, nice solid change for Bonemare. Kind of forgotten about this card being nerf worthy, but Blizzard said it was, and hey, they made a solid change. Again, maybe a little late, but that seems to be a trend, so I'm okay with that as long as they get it right in the long run, and I think Bonemare here remains sort of playable. I don't think it's going to be everywhere by any means. I don't think it was even everywhere right now, but I think it could still maybe make the cut in Tempo Rogue. We'll have to see. They might just switch to things like Lich King instead, which was already starting to happen regardless. So the playability is reduced a tad, but still a card that might show up from time to time in lists that are able to use it really well. And there you go, guys. That's my review of the 4 new nerfs. I think good, smart changes in general. I think Corridor Creeper maybe went a little too far. Maybe 3 attack would have been a more reasonable middle ground. Maybe a 4/4 would have been reasonable too. It didn't kill the card quite so hard. Everything else I think was really reasonable changes. Again, I'll say it 1,000 times. They came a little late. I wish we'd gotten these sooner. A lot of people have gotten frustrated by these cards for a really long time. Some of them might have already left Hearthstone because they were so frustrated by these cards. That's super unfortunate. Hopefully these changes are enough to give people some faith in Blizzard and bring them back into the fold to play Hearthstone once again. I certainly hope that's the case. All that said, I'm curious what you guys think about these changes. Were they good? Were they bad? Did they do enough? Did they come soon enough? Did they come too late for you? Did you already give up? What cards do you think should have been nerfed that weren't on this list? What else didn't make the cut? Maybe some Warlock stuff. We didn't really touch Cube Warlock, so it feels like maybe Warlock might be dominant moving forward. That's kind of a scary thought. Possessed Lackey, Void Lord type shenanigans, maybe those deserve to be nerfed too? Share your thoughts in the comments below, but until then, everybody, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.